The summer sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns and pristine driveways of the Davidson estate. Young Michael, no more than 8, sat on the front steps of the grand house, his small hands clutching a toy car. The world around him was one of quiet luxury, ornate gates, polished cars, and the soft murmur of sprinklers in the distance. It was a world that seemed perfect on the surface, but beneath it, unseen currents shaped the boy's mind in ways he could not yet comprehend. His father, Richard Davidson, was a towering figure in Michael's life. Richard wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a man of influence, his presence commanding respect or fear from everyone in their small, predominantly white community. The way Richard carried himself, the way he spoke and acted, were lessons to Michael. The lessons were subtle, woven into the fabric of everyday life, like the muted tones of a well-worn tapestry. "Michael!" Richard called, his voice sharp yet controlled, the kind that brokered no argument. Michael looked up, seeing his father standing tall near the garage, talking to Mr. Simmons, the gardener. Simmons was an older man, his skin dark and weathered, his back bent slightly from years of hard labor. Michael knew Simmons by name, but nothing more. The man was a fixture of the estate, like the hedges he meticulously trimmed every week. As Michael approached, his father's voice took on a different tone, one Michael had learned to recognize: disdain, laced with condescension. Richard was speaking to Simmons, not in the warm, respectful manner he reserved for their white neighbors, but in the clipped, curt style he used when addressing those he considered beneath him. "I've told you before, Simmons," Richard said, his eyes cold. "The hedges are to be trimmed at precisely 3 feet. Not an inch more, not an inch less. We maintain standards here, unlike elsewhere." Michael, standing a few paces behind, watched intently. Simmons nodded, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Michael was too young to fully understand, but it lingered in his mind nonetheless. The exchange was brief, yet it left a lasting impression on the boy. His father turned to leave, not bothering to wait for a response, while Simmons silently resumed his work, the hum of the electric trimmer masking the tension that had settled in the air. As they walked back into the house, Michael's small legs struggling to keep up with his father's long strides, he dared to ask, "Why do you talk to Mr. Simmons like that, Dad?" Richard slowed his pace, glancing down at his son with an expression that was half amused, half annoyed. "Michael, there are things you'll understand when you're older," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Some people, they don't have the same values as we do. They don't understand what it takes to maintain a place like this. They're different, and sometimes you have to remind them of their place." The words were spoken with the casual certainty of someone who had never questioned his beliefs, and Michael, still too young to see the cracks in his father's logic, accepted them without question. The seed had been planted, and like the ivy that crept up the walls of their home, it began to take root in the fertile soil of his young mind. Later that evening, as Michael sat at the dinner table with his parents, he watched his father with newfound admiration. Richard was a man who commanded attention, who knew how to keep the world in order. His mother, Grace, sat beside him, her hands gracefully folded in her lap, nodding in agreement with everything Richard said. She rarely spoke out of turn, always deferring to Richard's judgment. To Michael, this dynamic seemed natural, the way things were meant to be. The conversation that evening turned, as it often did, to the state of the world outside their gated community. Richard spoke of the city with disdain, describing it as a place of chaos and disorder, where people didn't know their place, where they dared to aspire beyond their station. Grace would occasionally murmur her agreement, her voice a soft echo of her husband's. Michael listened, absorbing every word, every nuance. It was in these moments that the foundation of his worldview was laid. A world divided not by merit or character, but by something far more arbitrary, something he couldn't yet name but felt deeply. As the night drew to a close, Michael found himself back on the front steps, the toy car forgotten beside him. He stared out at the darkening sky, his young mind replaying the day's events. The words of his father echoed in his ears, mingling with the soft hum of the evening. There, in the quiet of the night, the lines between right and wrong blurred, and a small piece of Michael's innocence was lost to the shadows. Years passed, and the lessons Michael Davidson learned as a child took root and flourished. The boy who once looked up to his father with innocent admiration had grown into a man molded in his father's image. Richard Davidson had instilled in Michael not only the skills to navigate the world of business, but also the arrogance and deeply ingrained racism that defined his worldview. Michael's adolescence was spent under the shadow of his father's influence. Richard was not just a parent. He was a mentor, a figure whose approval Michael craved above all else. As Michael grew older, Richard's teachings became more explicit. The world, according to Richard, was divided into those who belonged and those who did not, an idea that Michael absorbed completely. When Michael entered adulthood, he carried with him the full weight of his father's beliefs. His confidence was unshakable, his sense of superiority over others, especially those who were different from him, was absolute. By the time Michael was in his 20s, he had mastered the art of condescension, wielding it with the same precision his father had once used. It was this arrogance, this belief in his inherent superiority that propelled him forward. But life has a way of changing the dynamics of power. Richard and Grace Davidson passed away when Michael was still young enough to grieve, but old enough to recognize the opportunity their absence presented. The death of his parents left a void, but it also left him with the freedom to shape his destiny without their oversight. Michael took the reins of his own life, driven by the desire to build something that would make his father proud, something that would solidify the Davidson name in the annals of business history. With an unrelenting drive, Michael threw himself into his work, determined to build a company that would stand as a monument to his father's legacy. He started from the ground up, leveraging the connections and influence his father had left behind. Each success added to his confidence, each failure only serving to deepen his resolve. Davidson Industries was born from this ambition, a company that quickly grew under Michael's leadership. He approached business with the same ruthlessness his father had taught him, seeing competitors as obstacles to be crushed and viewing those who worked for him as tools to be used and discarded as needed. The arrogance that had been seeded in his childhood had now blossomed into a full-blown contempt for anyone who did not measure up to his standards. By the time Michael was in his early 30s, Davidson Industries had become a formidable force in the business world. Michael Davidson stood before the full-length mirror in his office, adjusting his tie. The navy blue silk slipped easily through his fingers, the knot tightening into a perfect Windsor. He straightened his suit jacket, the fabric immaculate, as it always was. In the corner of the mirror, the gleaming nameplate on his desk caught the light. Michael Davidson, CEO. It was a title he had worn for years, a title he believed he had earned through sheer will and intellect. He glanced at the clock. 15 minutes until the meeting. A surge of anticipation swelled within him, not unlike the feeling of stepping onto a battlefield, fully armed and confident in victory. The meeting today was critical, a gathering of potential clients who could steer Davidson Industries through the financial turbulence it was facing. But to Michael, it was more than that. It was another opportunity to assert his dominance, to remind everyone who held the reins. He picked up his phone, scanning through emails and messages. Most were routine, updates from department heads, requests for approval. He dismissed them with a few quick taps, uninterested in the details. That's what his team was for. His job was to make the big decisions, to keep the company afloat while others took care of the minutiae. He knew his worth, and he knew how indispensable he was. Michael's thoughts drifted to the meeting ahead. He visualized the room, the faces that would be around the table. Most were familiar. Men and women who had courted Davidson Industries for years, desperate for a piece of the action. They needed him more than he needed them, and that power dynamic was something he relished. As he exited his office, he was met by his assistant, Sarah, who handed him a folder with the meeting agenda. "Everything's set, Mr. Davidson. The clients have arrived and are waiting in the boardroom." "Good," Michael replied, barely glancing at her. Sarah was efficient, competent, but ultimately invisible to him. She did her job well, which was all that mattered. He didn't need to know more. He walked briskly down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. Employees he passed greeted him with a mix of respect and fear, nodding as he went by. Michael returned their gestures with a curt nod, his mind already on the meeting. The elevator ride to the boardroom felt interminable, the smooth descent accompanied by the soft hum of the machinery. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out, greeted by the sleek, modern design of the executive floor. The walls were adorned with minimalist art, carefully curated to exude sophistication without distraction. It was a space designed to impress, to remind visitors of the power and prestige of Davidson Industries. Michael reached the boardroom and paused at the door, taking a breath. He didn't need to prepare. His confidence was built on years of success and the unshakable belief in his own superiority. With a final glance at his reflection in the glass, he pushed open the door. The room fell silent as he entered. All eyes turned to him, the unspoken recognition of authority palpable. Michael moved to the head of the table, his usual place, and surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the familiar faces, each one eager, some anxious. He enjoyed the momentary tension, the way they waited for his cue. And then he saw her. Sitting near the middle of the table, amidst the sea of suits and ties, was a woman he didn't recognize. Her presence was jarring, not because she was a woman, but because she was the only black person in the room. She was dressed sharply, her posture confident, but it wasn't enough to mask the discomfort that prickled at Michael's mind. He had seen many faces in his career, but this one was new, and it unsettled him. The boardroom was a study in contrasts. The cool, clinical lines of modern design clashed with the undercurrent of tension that hung in the air. Michael Davidson, seated at the head of the table, exuded an aura of practiced authority. The clients, each with their neatly arranged documents and guarded expressions, were well aware of his reputation. They had come prepared, but there was no mistaking the unease that settled over the room like a heavy fog. Rachel Thompson sat near the middle of the table, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had spent years cultivating that calm, a shield against the microaggressions and condescension she encountered in rooms like this. Her dark eyes scanned the pages before her, but her mind was focused on something far more significant. This meeting was a pivotal moment, not just for her company, but for her career. The stakes were high, and Rachel was determined to seize the opportunity. As the discussion unfolded, Michael spoke with his usual blend of confidence and arrogance, outlining the virtues of his company's business model. His words were polished, each syllable carefully chosen to convey dominance. Rachel listened intently, taking mental notes, her fingers occasionally brushing against the smooth surface of her pen. She knew the model had its strengths, but she also saw the cracks, a short-sighted approach that would struggle to adapt in the rapidly changing market. When the moment came, Rachel spoke, her voice steady and measured. "Mr. Davidson, you've highlighted the past successes of your business model. But I'm curious, how do you see it evolving over the next few years? Specifically, how do you plan to address the emerging trends that could challenge its sustainability? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Michael, waiting for his response. For a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like Rachel. The tension in the room thickened, becoming almost tangible. The boardroom was still, the tension palpable as Michael Davidson's icy gaze bore into Rachel Thompson. She had dared to challenge him, to question the very foundation of the business empire he had built. For a man like Michael, whose ego was as vast as his corporate holdings, this was an unforgivable affront. His pride stung, his anger simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. The other attendees sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. They watched in uneasy silence, aware of the storm brewing but unwilling to intervene. It was a silence born of self-preservation, each person too afraid of the repercussions that might come from challenging Michael's authority. Michael leaned forward, his voice cold and mocking, as he addressed Rachel. "Tell me, Miss Thompson," he began, his tone laced with venom, "which black community college did you attend that made you think you're intelligent enough to question my business model?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Rachel blinked, taken aback by the blatant racism, but she quickly regained her composure. "I attended the University of Chicago," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. Michael's lip curled into a sneer. University of Chicago. And here I was thinking they had standards. His words dripped with disdain. But I suppose they had to fill their diversity quotas, didn't they? You're probably just here because your company wanted to show how inclusive they are. A token, if you will. The silence in the room deepened. Rachel could feel the eyes of the other attendees on her, their collective discomfort almost tangible. Yet no one spoke up. No one came to her defense. Their silence was a betrayal, a stark reminder that in this room she was utterly alone. "Let's be clear, Miss Thompson," Michael continued, his voice growing harsher with each word. "You lack the intelligence, the vision, to contribute anything meaningful here. Your opinion is unnecessary, and frankly, you should probably just keep quiet." Rachel's hands tightened into fists beneath the table, her knuckles white. The humiliation was overwhelming, the anger simmering just beneath her calm exterior. She had faced discrimination before, but never so openly, so viciously. Yet the room remained silent, the other attendees shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to meet her gaze. Michael's eyes narrowed as he watched her struggle to maintain her composure. He reveled in her discomfort, mistaking it for submission. "Look around you," he said. "Do you see anyone else who looks like you in this room? There's a reason for that. People like you don't belong here. You're out of your depth, and it's time you realized that." But he wasn't done yet. "I apologize if my words seem harsh," he said, the insincerity in his voice clear, "but someone has to teach monkeys like you where you belong." The finality of his words struck Rachel like a physical blow. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to give him the satisfaction. She had spent her entire career fighting for the respect she deserved, and she wasn't about to let Michael Davidson strip that away from her. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Davidson," Rachel said, her voice firm despite the turmoil raging inside her. She stood, pushing her chair back with a deliberate motion, her gaze locked on Michael's. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Rachel turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive stillness. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the judgment, the pity, the discomfort. But no one moved to stop her, no one offered a word of support. The door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing the room in a stunned, awkward silence. Michael leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He believed he had won, that he had put Rachel in her place. The silence of the room was, to him, a validation of his power, of his superiority. But even as the meeting resumed, the discomfort lingered. The other attendees, now forced to engage with Michael, did so with a cautious distance, their words measured, their smiles forced. The tension in the room was palpable, and though Michael chose to ignore it, it was clear that something had shifted. As Michael looked around the table, he saw only the reflection of his own arrogance staring back at him. The meeting ended, and as the attendees filed out, there was no chatter, no camaraderie, only the cold, heavy silence of a room where something irreparable had taken place. Michael returned to his office, his confidence intact, unaware that the seeds of his downfall had been sown in that very room. The arrogance that had fueled his attack on Rachel had blinded him to the reality of his situation. Michael Davidson leaned back in his leather chair, the familiar creak of the old wood punctuating the silence in his office. He could still feel the lingering energy from the boardroom, the way the tension had crackled just beneath the surface, feeding his sense of superiority. It was a feeling he relished: control, power, the certainty that he had put everyone in their place. He reached for the glass of whiskey on his desk, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow, deliberate sip. The burn down his throat was a reminder of victory, of dominance asserted and unquestioned. He replayed the meeting in his mind, savoring the moment when Rachel had finally backed down, leaving the room with her head held high, but her spirit clearly crushed. She had challenged him, dared to question his authority, and he had responded in kind. Michael prided himself on knowing how to handle people, how to remind them of where they stood in the pecking order, especially when they forgot their place. He smirked at the thought. People like Rachel, with their high-minded ideals and misplaced confidence, always needed a reality check. His thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of the phone on his desk. He glanced at the caller ID. Roger Miller. A small frown creased his brow, but he quickly brushed it off. Roger was a powerful man, the CEO of Miller Trading, and their upcoming partnership was critical for Davidson Industries. Michael had been looking forward to solidifying their deal in the meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. He picked up the receiver, his voice smooth and controlled. "Roger, good to hear from you. I was just thinking about our meeting later." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat too long to be casual. When Roger finally spoke, his voice was cold, clipped in a way that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. "Michael, we need to talk." Michael's grip on the receiver tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, Roger. What's on your mind?" "You humiliated my daughter." The words landed like a blow, sharp and unexpected. Michael blinked, his mind racing to catch up with what he had just heard. "Your daughter," he repeated, the confusion clear in his voice. "I'm sorry, Roger, but I'm not sure I understand." "Rachel Thompson," Roger interrupted, his voice now tinged with a controlled fury that Michael had never heard from him before. "The woman you decided to publicly disgrace in front of your entire boardroom? That's my daughter." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the blood draining from his face, the confidence that had been so solid moments ago slipping through his fingers like sand. "Roger, I had no idea." "Save it, Michael," Roger snapped, cutting him off. "I trusted you. I thought you were a man of integrity, someone I could do business with. But today, you showed me exactly who you are." The silence on the line was deafening. Michael struggled to find his voice, his thoughts a tangled mess of panic and disbelief. "Roger, please, let me explain. I never intended—" "What you intended doesn't matter," Roger said, his voice cold and final. "What matters is what you did. You humiliated my daughter because you thought you could. You thought no one would hold you accountable. Well, Michael, you're wrong." Michael's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation, but every possible argument seemed to dissolve before he could grasp it. "Roger, I'm sorry. I can fix this. Let's meet, talk this through." "There's nothing to talk about," Roger replied, his tone as unyielding as steel. "Effective immediately. Miller Trading is severing all ties with Davidson Industries. Our deal is off. And believe me, Michael, I'll make sure the rest of the industry knows exactly why." The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at the receiver in stunned silence. The room felt colder now, the walls closing in around him as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. His heart pounded in his chest, the smug satisfaction he had felt earlier replaced by a gnawing dread. Roger Miller's words echoed in his mind, each syllable carving deep into the armor of arrogance he had worn for so long. "Rachel is my daughter." The statement, so simple, yet so damning, had shattered the foundation of his carefully constructed world. The glass of whiskey on his desk remained untouched, the amber liquid now a mockery of the victory he had once savored. For the first time in years, Michael felt something foreign, panic. It was subtle at first, a quiet unease in the pit of his stomach. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew, spreading through his veins like ice, freezing the bravado that had carried him through countless boardrooms and negotiations. His mind raced, grasping for a way out, for a solution that would undo the damage. "I need to fix this." The thought hit him like a jolt, sparking a desperate flurry of activity. Michael grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Rachel's number. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the call button. He had humiliated her, belittled her in front of everyone. How could he possibly make amends? But the fear of losing everything pushed him forward. He pressed the button, holding the phone to his ear as it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. "Rachel, it's Michael," he began, his voice shaky but determined. I need to talk to you. Please, call me back. It's important." He hung up and immediately called again, this time more frantic. The same result. He left another message, his tone shifting from assertive to pleading. "Rachel, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I didn't mean. Please, we need to talk. I need to make this right." But deep down, Michael knew that no amount of apologies could erase what he had done. The coldness in Roger's voice had made that clear. This wasn't just a professional misstep. It was a personal betrayal, one that had severed ties far more valuable than any business deal. His reputation, his company, his entire legacy. They were all on the line, teetering on the edge of ruin. Michael's thoughts spiraled as he dialed Rachel's number again, his desperation mounting with each unanswered call. His mind conjured images of his empire crumbling, of partners withdrawing their support, of his name being dragged through the mud in the business community. The panic that had started as a whisper was now a roar, drowning out all rational thought. He left yet another voicemail, this time barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Rachel, please, just talk to me. I can explain. I didn't know. I was wrong, okay? I was wrong." Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. Michael's office, once a sanctuary of power and control, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around him. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle any crisis, to turn any situation to his advantage. But this was different. This was personal. Finally, his phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. A message. He snatched it up, his heart pounding, only to feel it sink as he read Rachel's response. "You're not sorry for what you said. You're only sorry because you got caught. Don't contact me again." The words were a dagger, cutting through the last remnants of Michael's composure. He stared at the screen, the reality of his situation crashing down on him with brutal clarity. Rachel's rejection wasn't just a refusal to forgive. It was a final, irrevocable judgment on the man he had become. Michael dropped the phone onto his desk, the room spinning around him. The panic was no longer just a feeling. It was a reality. The consequences of his actions had begun, and for the first time in his life, Michael Davidson was utterly, completely powerless. The days that followed Roger Miller's call were a blur of panic and denial. Michael Davidson, once so sure of his place at the top, found himself grappling with a reality he could scarcely comprehend. The familiar hum of phones and clicking keyboards seemed distant, muffled by the growing sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the financial reports spread before him. The numbers, once a source of pride, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Revenue was down, costs were up, and the steady stream of client withdrawals was beginning to look less like a trend and more like a death sentence. Each morning, his inbox greeted him with more bad news: contracts terminated, partnerships dissolved, and polite but firm refusals from those he once considered allies. The phone rang, breaking the oppressive silence. Michael snatched it up, half expecting yet another blow to his already battered company. Instead, it was Sarah, his assistant, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Davidson, there's a Mr. Henderson on the line. He wants to discuss the upcoming merger." Michael's heart lifted slightly. Henderson was a key player, someone who could help turn things around if handled correctly. "Put him through," he said, forcing a note of confidence into his voice. The line clicked, and Henderson's voice came through, clipped and businesslike. "Michael, we need to talk." "Of course, Henderson. I've been meaning to—" "I'll be brief," Henderson interrupted, his tone sharp. "We're pulling out of the merger." Michael's blood ran cold. "What? Why? We've been negotiating for months." "Things have changed," Henderson said, cutting him off again. "Word's gotten around about what happened with Rachel Thompson. It's bad for business, Michael. No one wants to be associated with a company that's got this kind of scandal hanging over it." Michael felt his grip on the phone tighten, his knuckles white. "This is absurd. One incident, blown out of proportion." "Maybe," Henderson replied, his voice unyielding. "But perception is reality in this industry, and right now the perception is that Davidson Industries is a sinking ship. I'm not going down with it." Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated itself with crushing regularity. Meetings were scheduled, then cancelled at the last minute. Long-time clients who had once praised his leadership now avoided his calls. Each rejection chipped away at Michael's confidence, turning what had once been unshakable certainty into a gnawing fear that kept him awake at night. His office, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in on him as the hours dragged by, the weight of his mistakes pressing down with relentless force. The people around him, his employees, his colleagues, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes filled with pity and, worse, disdain. He could feel their judgment, their silent condemnation of the man who had once been their leader. The real blow, though, came from the industry itself. Roger Miller's influence was pervasive, his word carrying more weight than any official statement. Clients who had been loyal for years began to question his decisions, his judgment. Deals that had once seemed certain fell apart with alarming speed, leaving Michael scrambling to pick up the pieces. In the quiet moments, alone in his office, Michael's thoughts turned inward, his mind a storm of regret and self-recrimination. He replayed the events in his head, each mistake glaring in its clarity. The humiliation of Rachel Thompson, the arrogance with which he had dismissed her, the foolish belief that his power was untouchable, all of it led to this. The days bled into one another, each more desperate than the last. And as Michael sat in his office, staring out at the city he had once ruled, he felt the full weight of his fall, the realization that there might be no way back. Michael Davidson sat alone in his office, the room now a hollow echo of the power it once radiated. The polished surfaces, the sleek furniture, the carefully chosen artwork, none of it held meaning anymore. The silence was oppressive, filling the space where the hum of activity and the confidence of success used to reside. The room had become a tomb, a place where the remnants of his empire lay in ruins. His gaze drifted across the empty desks outside his glass-walled sanctuary. Rows of vacant chairs, once occupied by bustling employees, now stood as silent reminders of what he had lost. The bustling energy that had once defined Davidson Industries had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet that gnawed at his sanity. Michael turned his chair slowly to face the window, looking out over the city skyline. The view that had once filled him with pride now felt distant, unattainable. He had built this company from the ground up, had shaped it with his own hands, driven by a vision of success that he had believed was his birthright. But that vision had been distorted by arrogance, by a belief that he was untouchable. His thoughts wandered to the faces of the people he had let go, the ones who had built their lives around the company he was now forced to dismantle. Sarah, his loyal assistant, who had stood by him through every crisis, had been the first to go. He had watched the shock and disappointment in her eyes as he told her the news, her professionalism cracking just enough for him to see the fear beneath. Then came the others, department heads, managers, clerks, all of them blindsided by the suddenness of it all. They had trusted him, believed in the stability he had promised, and he had failed them. Michael sighed, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. The financial reports on his desk told a story of inevitable collapse, each line of red ink a reminder of the mistakes he had made. He had tried to stave off the inevitable, had fought to keep the company afloat, but it had been like bailing water from a sinking ship. Every effort had been met with another failure, another blow to his pride. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. The decision had been made, but the act of following through felt like a betrayal of everything he had once believed. His fingers hovered over the keypad, hesitating. He had always prided himself on being decisive, on making the tough calls, without flinching. But this was different. This was the end. Finally, he dialed the number, his voice hollow as he spoke. "This is Michael Davidson. Schedule a meeting with the board. We need to discuss the liquidation process." The words hung in the air, each one a dagger to his chest. There was no going back now, no more time for second chances or desperate gambles. He had played every card, and he had lost. The rest of the day passed in a blur of motions. Final meetings, signing off on documents, delivering the news to the last remaining employees. Each conversation felt like another nail in the coffin, the expressions of disbelief and sorrow on their faces only deepening the chasm of regret inside him. He could see the question in their eyes, even if they didn't dare to voice it. How did it come to this? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, Michael found himself back in his chair, staring at the now empty space where his employees had once thrived. Michael leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. The reality of it all pressed down on him, a crushing weight that left him gasping for air. The arrogance that had once propelled him to the top had now brought him to his knees, and there was no one left to blame but himself. Michael Davidson sat in the dimly lit living room of his once opulent home, the silence thick around him. The house, now devoid of the energy that had once filled it, felt more like a relic of a past life than a place of refuge. The walls, lined with photographs and awards, seemed to mock him, each image a reminder of the man he had been, confident, powerful, untouchable. But that man no longer existed. He reached for the newspaper on the table, his hands trembling slightly. The headline was brutal, the kind that cut deep. Former CEO Michael Davidson, a legacy tainted by racism and hubris. The words blurred as he stared at them, a cold realization settling over him. This was what he had become, a cautionary tale, a man whose name was now synonymous with disgrace. As he read through the article, the accusations and judgments piled up, each one striking closer to the truth he had been avoiding. His arrogance, his prejudice, the way he had treated Rachel Thompson, it was all laid bare, dissected in black and white for the world to see. There was no escaping it now, no denying the impact of his actions. The regret gnawed at him, a relentless ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. He thought about the people he had hurt, the employees he had failed, the opportunities he had squandered. But most of all, he thought about Rachel, the woman who had stood up to him, only to be crushed under the weight of his ego. Her face haunted him, a constant reminder of the man he had allowed himself to become. Michael leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had lost everything, his company, his reputation, his future. But in the midst of that loss, there was a quiet realization, a painful but necessary understanding of the choices that had led him here. There would be no redemption for him, no miraculous comeback. The damage was done, and the world had moved on without him. But as he sat there, alone in the silence, Michael finally accepted the full weight of his mistakes. The arrogance that had driven him to the top had also brought him crashing down. And in the ruins of his life, he found a clarity that had eluded him for years. The room grew darker as the evening deepened, the shadows lengthening around him. Michael didn't move, didn't speak. He simply sat, a man stripped of everything but the harsh lessons he had been forced to learn. Wow, what a powerful story. It's a stark reminder of the deep-seated issues that still exist in our society, issues that affect real lives every day. Michael Davidson's journey is a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and prejudice. It shows us that the walls we build to elevate ourselves can often become the very thing that causes our downfall. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. We need to keep these conversations going, because change starts with awareness. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one. We dive into real issues, thought-provoking stories, and more right here on this channel. Thank you for watching, and remember, let's always strive to be better, to see the humanity in others and to challenge the biases that hold us all back. I'll see you in the next video.